One thing that you might want to do in React.js is adjust state when props change. Now, there's a problematic way to do this and a much better way to do this, and we're going to cover that here today. So if we come to VS Code, you can see that this is the page that I have rendered here. We see problematic using useEffect, best deriving state from props. We see that problematic using useEffect, best deriving state for props. So we have this application here and we render two different lists, our problematic list and our best list. So let's look at the problematic list here first. We pass an array of items to this problematic list here. And then we also have a piece of state here called selection and set selection. And then we basically use a useEffect hook to set the set selection to null when the items change. So what this looks like in our app is that if we, select a different item here, and then we change the items, it basically deselects the item. We can do this again, and we won't even actually change the items here, but it'll just re-render the page. It'll kind of deselect the item. So this useEffect here, whenever these items change, it is going to set the selection to null. Now, what's wrong with doing things this way? Well, for one, it's going to cause unnecessary re-renders. This problematic list, it is first going to render to the page, and then this useEffect is going to run after this component mounts. It's going to recognize, okay, the items are now different from the previous items, so we need to set the selection to null. And when you set state in React, it is then going to re-render this list again. So we're going to kind of re-render this problematic list twice when these items change. And then also, sometimes you'll notice in your app that you'll get a component that it kind of has a flicker to it, meaning it renders kind of like some stale state first, and then that state gets updated. Well, this is one situation to where that would happen here as well, to where we're going to initially render this list display with the current selection, but then we're going to recognize that, oh, these items are different, so we're going to re-render the page and set the selection to null. So if you had like a component that took a little bit longer to render, we're not going to notice in this case because it's so fast, but if it took a little longer to render, you might notice the selection flicker a little bit. To where initially the selection is still going to be whatever we selected, but then it's going to recognize the items are different, and it's going to re-render this component where selection is set to null. So you can kind of get that stale state effect. So this would not be the best way of kind of handling this. So a better way of doing this would actually be to derive state from props. So in this best list, we still pass our items array, and then we still have a piece of state here, a selection ID and set selected ID. However, we derive our selection from our selected ID as well as a prop. We check during the render process what our selection is. So rather than setting our selection using a useEffect here, so using an effect to do it, not doing it during the render process, we do it here during the render process to figure out what our selection is and then pass it to our list display. So when we set a selection, we just set a selection ID, and then we derive that selection based on that selected ID and the items. The selection or the selected ID, both of them, are going to remain the same on re-renders unless that item doesn't exist in the new items array, which is probably the behavior that you want here. Like if you pass a new items array, but only one of the items are different, well, you might want the selected item to remain the same. And in this case, it would. So if we look at this behavior, I'm going to refresh here. Say I select apple or banana in both of them, and then I click change items. Okay, banana doesn't exist in this list, so that's what we want. But now let's select date in both and change items. And notice when I click change items here, it's going to set the items to date and elderberry by default. So the items aren't actually going to change. It's just going to re-render the components. So I do this, and you can see in the problematic way of doing it, it still resets the selection because technically speaking here, we reset our items to a new array of items. Even though they're like the same items, it's still a new referenced array. So here in our useEffect, it's going to pick up that that's a new list of items and it's going to set our selection to null. But here it's going to say, hey, our selected ID still exists in the items array. So we still want that to be our selection. And in this way, we're not going to have to trigger our unnecessary re-renders or our stale state because we are deriving our selection here during the render process rather than doing it within a useEffect here. So the take-home message here of this video is that anytime you find yourself setting state, so setting selection here, setting state in the useEffect based off of props, like what we're doing here, we're using this useEffect to track the items array and setting state. Anytime you find yourself doing this, just know that there might be a better way because this can cause unnecessary re-renders and sometimes that flicker effect of stale state. And in reality, you can probably structure things a little bit differently, like what we do down here, in which we have our selection and we derive that from our props as well as our piece of state here. So hopefully that's clear. Hopefully you learned something from this video and I'll see you in that next one.